Imagine billions of dollars accumulated through the sweat and blood of millions of people disappear without a trace. The money of the USSR, which could have changed the destinies of entire generations, saved millions of families from poverty and hunger, repaired factories, built housing, gave hope to an entire country, ended up abroad. There it did not vanish into oblivion, did not dissolve in the flames of war, nor did it drown in the chaos of the state's collapse. No, this money was carefully, slowly, and methodically transferred to the most reliable safes in London. And here begins a story that many were afraid to tell aloud. Imagine a vast empire where every worker, every factory, and every barrel of oil contributed to a common fund to build a powerful economy. These billions of dollars did not simply disappear into the dust of archives or the flames of change. They were carefully transferred to accounts in British banks, where they grew with interest, becoming a source of someone else's wealth. This is one of the most grandiose financial maneuvers of the 20th century, carried out without noise or violence, turning public savings into an instrument of pressure and personal gain. In the early part of the last century, British banks became a quiet haven for capital from all over the world, asking no unnecessary questions about its origin. For the young Soviet Union, striving to establish itself on the global stage, London seemed an ideal place to store gold and currency in relative safety. No one suspected that this apparent reliability would turn into a trap when the system collapsed, and the successors would try to claim what belonged to millions. Soviet diplomats and financiers opened the first deposits back in the 30s to finance trade with the West and purchase machinery, equipment, and technology for an industrial leap. These accounts were replenished year after year, accumulating funds from resource exports, and became the foundation for future growth. But what if this foundation turned out to be shaky? What happened when the world plunged into the chaos of global conflict? Even during times when Moscow was ablaze under attacks, gold reserves and dollar reserves continued to flow into British accounts, symbolizing a strange trust in the Western system and hinting at future disputes. After the triumph over the enemy, these funds did not return to their homeland. On the contrary, their volume only increased. British financiers welcomed the inflow of billions from a mysterious power with its symbols and ideas, paying no attention to rumors of internal difficulties. For them, these were simply assets, especially valuable when the owner was in no hurry to claim them. These accumulations, reaching hundreds of millions in today's money, were supposed to become the backbone for post-war revival, but instead they lay dormant, awaiting the moment when the economy would begin to falter. Why, in an era of stability, did these reserves turn into a hidden instrument rather than a lifeline? In the 60s, the Soviet Union discovered new opportunities. Western banks became not just a storage facility, but a platform for secret operations. Currency flows from the sale of gas, metals, and even armaments poured in like a river. According to insider accounts, more than $1 billion passed through London annually, equivalent to the budgets of entire regions today. On the surface, it looked like routine trade, loans, letters of credit, transfers. But behind the scenes, a network of shell companies and anonymous accounts unfolded, allowing them to bypass restrictions and acquire what was officially prohibited. Documents were accompanied by secret orders, encrypted messages, and diplomatic channels to conceal the true objectives. British specialists were well aware of the underlying context, but preferred not to notice, seeing these billions as a long-term asset. By the 80s, when the economy began to falter, these reserves, about $20 billion in today's equivalent, could have covered the deficit and supported stability. However, access to them depended on the owner's consent, and it was then that the true nature of this captivity became apparent. In the corridors of power, whispers circulated about the need for a special approach to succession, leaving funds under lock and key. But why, at the moment of collapse, did this system turn against its creators? In 1991, when a vast country was erased from the maps, a long-awaited moment arrived in London. The new Russia plunged into internal turmoil, lost its grip on foreign assets, and into this vacuum rushed crowds. Lawyers, officials, adventurers disguised as official representatives, waving dubious papers to claim huge sums. A grueling negotiation began behind closed doors, where banks clung to convoluted formulations from the era of confrontation and demanded thorough verification. In reality, it came down to a simple matter. Billions remained in their hands, earning interest and enriching their owners, while millions of former citizens struggled with shortages, ruin, and the loss of their savings. Documents from the archives confirm regular transfers to institutions like Midland and Barclays, where amounts grew to astronomical figures. These funds, intended to guarantee the future, became a noose and a lever of influence. Financiers openly considered them indeterminate property, allowing the bureaucracy to stall for time and accumulate profits. While Russia tried to sort out the tangle of debts, basic information about the accounts remained inaccessible. Requests drowned in form letters, and bank secrecy was insurmountable. To file a lawsuit, it was necessary to prove rights, but without data, it was a vicious circle. The press flashed figures from 5 to 50 billion, but without access to sources, they hung in the air. Meanwhile, London was teeming with claimants, with fake mandates, forgeries, and yellowed signatures of departed figures, creating chaos that benefited the custodians. Why couldn't even official groups break through this wall? Banks erected a barricade of lawyers and experts, citing the unique nature of the state's collapse and the need for special procedures. Essentially, it was a sophisticated refusal disguised as a desire to retain assets. While Russia was drowning in privatization and power struggles, Western structures were in no hurry to help, allowing interest to accrue and accounts to grow. Diplomats acknowledged the cynical approach. Money collected by the people through labor in factories and mines was now strengthening a foreign system. Requests went out for months, returning with refusals, and attempts to obtain information were met with demands for court orders, which were impossible without proof. The press buzzed with statements about colossal sums abroad, but without confirmation, they faded away. London buzzed with a wave of dubious visitors. Every month, someone appeared with seals from fake departments or old papers demanding a share. Banks feigned consideration, but this only further confused the picture, hindering genuine efforts. In Russia, inflation devoured incomes. Pensioners stood in line for basic goods. Families sold their last possessions, unaware of the billions in foreign safes, funds that belonged not to an abstract state, but to everyone who paid taxes and fulfilled plans. When the Kremlin formed special teams for repatriation, the situation was already desperate. The defense of lawyers insisted on the unprecedented nature of events, delaying any action. Experienced negotiators saw the coldness of their opponents. While the country slid into chaos, no one showed empathy, and the bank's reputation grew stronger on the back of foreign reserves. But what if this wall hid not only refusals, but also active attempts to seize parts of the pie? In 1993, one enterprising businessman brought a whole folder of powers of attorney to London, allegedly signed by ministers of various republics, trying under this pretext to gain access to deposits and disappear with the loot. Banks sometimes feigned belief in such papers to further confuse the picture and avoid disclosing real figures to official inquiries. The more pretenders appeared, the harder it became to confirm true rights, creating a perfect backdrop for maintaining the status quo. Such games allowed the funds to remain in their investment portfolios, where they yielded stable profits, while the people suffered from economic hardships. The press picked up on rare scandals, articles about strange schemes, one-day companies, and offshore accounts on islands, but these materials appeared as small notes and quickly got lost in the stream. People were too busy surviving to delve into the layer of legal subtleties, and under this guise, Western experts assured that all problems lay in the ambiguity of succession and the weakness of institutions and corruption. But the truth behind such rhetoric hid simple profit. Assets worked for someone else's development, while those who created them through their labor were left with nothing. Particularly striking was the case of Khrushchev-era deposits. One account, intended for equipment purchases, grew to 500 million, which in today's equivalent is almost $1 billion. But the bank required the consent of all former republics, making repayment unattainable. Newspapers cautiously hinted at frozen assets, admitting that banks used procedures as a pretext to retain the entire national heritage. But the people were unaware that percentages from their own contributions were accumulating behind the queues for goods. Parliamentary commissions thundered with accusations, demanding funds and stabilization, but time had been lost, and under the silence, it was hidden that the funds became part of someone else's well-being. Law firms acted as intermediaries, dissecting each document. Who signed? Which entity owned it? Could the new power claim collectively accumulated property? The confusion was not accidental. Bankers admitted in conversations that the ambiguity allowed them to continue using deposits, generating profits. Diplomats waited weeks for meetings in elegant offices, received coffee and promises of review, but each time left empty-handed while time ran out against them. Simultaneously, fortune hunters emerged. Individuals with forged mandates rushed to claim a share, exacerbating the chaos. These raids allowed them not to reveal their cards, while the people endured inflation, poverty, and the collapse of industries, unaware of the foreign percentages. Litigation commissions were formed with the theory of simple tasks: gather evidence, initiate dialogue. But in practice, they hit a labyrinth where each step required new confirmations, and debt claims were applied strictly, while deposits led to an endless process. Insiders heard directly from bankers, "We know the funds are yours, but the formalities allow us to retain them." This sophisticated pretense left Russia in need, while portfolios were filled with millions in profits, settling into stocks and bonuses. Whispers of betrayal by former leaders were heard in offices. They themselves created the system of foreign storage, not anticipating the collapse, and the subjects learned only fragments from newspaper notes, not understanding that the billions were their own share of the future. Journalists tried to stir public opinion, raising the question of a large-scale peaceful seizure, but the articles faded so as not to spoil the image of the financial stronghold, as an admission threatened a wave of claims from other countries. Thus, an unwritten agreement was formed. The assets would remain and negotiations would drag on, reducing the chances of success, as if everything happening was a pre-planned scheme. Keepers of secrets used the funds for investments without fear of consequences, and behind closed doors discussed how to cement their status through trusts and offshore accounts, paid for by those very percentages. The country simmered with privatization and financial shocks, pushing the issue into the shadows. Although specialists understood, this could have saved millions from hardship. Even after succession agreements, when debts had to be repaid, banks insisted on extensive expertise, unchanging for years, creating the illusion of a hidden directive to ignore rights. Commentators explained it as caution to avoid conflicts, but the essence was cynical. Profits strengthened power, while repayment threatened losses. Delegations initiated arbitrations but faced a lack of grounds, as documents disappeared during the collapse crisis, making the inability of a superpower to protect its reserves paradoxical. This rule solidified: money is stronger than ideals, and the process became an elegant maneuver without fanfare. Investigations unearthed correspondence where refusals were hidden behind formulas, but confidentiality blocked details, forming an impenetrable wall. Deputies spoke accusingly, but time was short, while percentages accrued, and hidden earnings lay beneath profits. Interviews with veterans spoke of shattered illusions of partnership that crumbled in an instant, leaving the safe locked. Leaders changed, but the answers remained the same. Request under consideration, while anecdotes circulated about access to records where percentages far exceeded deposits. One account for equipment grew to $3 billion, but without the consent of the republics, repayment was unattainable, especially for bonds converted into holdings. Negotiations showed that the funds would not be returned voluntarily as long as the process generated profits, and the parliament whispered about a seizure, but cautiously, to avoid burning bridges. Experts shrugged, citing difficulties, hiding their interest, while poverty plagued the country, and the funds became a farce. Aid arrived while their own savings accumulated for others. The number of informed individuals dwindled. Veterans took their knowledge with them, leaving the story as an experience, while the new decade offered a chance. But was it real? In the early 2000s, after recovering from shocks, deputies initiated negotiations with archives and bank support. The ground seemed solid, but the delegation faced demands for protocols and old powers of attorney, dragging everything into the classic pattern. Discussions about non-personified accounts from the 50s emphasized the absence of an owner, although Vneshekonombank was the sole entity. But arguments were lost. Behind the scenes, assets were invested in securities and real estate, generating bonuses and development, turning public funds into fuel for foreign power. Commission reports repeated without results, journalists asked about radical measures, but officials cited a lack of resources, leaving distrust. Enthusiasts, former diplomats, collected boxes of contracts and memoirs, speaking of the transformation into a resource of influence, recalling bankers' phrases about decade-long delays. Officials resigned themselves as the government kept its own wealth abroad, making the topic toxic. Reports showed profits but hid the source, and Parliament rarely raised the issue, losing itself in bureaucracy. The public saw it as a legend, not understanding that tens of billions could have changed lives, but the irony was that bankers, from partners, became owners without risk. The story dissolved into crises new generations forgot, but experts saw how the funds strengthened the capital's status through bonds and derivatives, financing projects. Politicians stepped back. Duma reports gave a range from 10 to 40 billion, but everyone knew precision was hidden. The mechanism worked for preservation. People took it as fiction. Journalists encountered politeness, leaving billions in the corridors. Commissions in the 2000s tried to unite the republics, but the countries refused, fearing conflicts. While the interest accumulated over 20 years reached billions, grotesquely used without accounting. Publications used the term frozen, but the essence was legalized seizure. Transformed into myths, where indifference became an ally, leaving the scam unpunished. Officials responded with stock phrases. The British taboo maintained silence. Leaks provided figures of annual profits of 200 million, dissipated into corporations, while political will was absent due to fear of humiliation. No one directly blamed. Chains of agreements hid the truth, leaving distrust, where assets became part of foreign empires. Commissions examined archives, but the inaccessibility of dossiers and lack of authority rendered everything useless, raising questions about past mistakes. Journalists admitted how the funds supported liquidity and projects, making London a hub, ironically reflecting on the labor of millions transformed into foreign gain. Years brought reports of income, consensus hid appropriation. By the end of the decade, the country had forgotten, but the assets accumulated, becoming the foundation for deals during crises, through offshore accounts and refusal templates. Reputation grew, politicians saw danger, society resigned itself, journalists got lost in the noise, veterans spoke of sins, leaving the era as an invisible support for foreign success. Years passed, requests languished, 30 years went by, banks grew, shareholders celebrated, clients praised stability, symbolizing defeat without a fight, where truth was not for allies, only resounding silence.